Welcome everyone who's joined us so far and those who are continuing to join us to our very special webinar event from the Hart House Literary and Library Committee this month, titled The World Building of Wakanda, exploring Black Panther and Afrofuturism. So this event is part of an ongoing series here at Hart House this month called Black Futures. And we'll discuss that in just a minute. But first, I want to introduce myself. So hello, everyone. My name is Vikram Najawan. I am part of the Hart House Literary and Library Committee at the University of Toronto. And specifically, I helm the Writers Co-op division. Now, at Writers Co-op, we usually handle the practical wing when it comes to creative writing, which includes subjects such as world building, which is why I was eager to jump on the opportunity to discuss world building in a very special and important context as it relates to the genre of Afrofuturism, and specifically the world of Wakanda in the Black Panther films and comic series. Now here at Lit and Lib and at Hart House, we feel it's incredibly important to promote this genre, which is perhaps lesser known among the general population. And I hope that through this discussion, everyone will be able to learn a thing or two. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land on which Hart House and U of T lies. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional home of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work, and in the case of Lit and Lib, to write on this land. Now, I feel the discussion of land is incredibly and especially important to our current discussion, which is all about geography, terrain, and general world building. So of course, we have to keep that in mind. And I also acknowledge that being the child of immigrants and a second generation immigrant and Canadian myself, that I have prospered on the land that Indigenous people have lived on for thousands of years. And I think it's especially important that as we become more cognizant of these things, we try to highlight lesser known forms of storytelling and narrative. One way I've tried to increase my fluency in that regard is through learning more about orality and oral storytelling, which has often been overlooked in favor of written storytelling. And I know a few of my panelists have also sought to do that in their respective endeavors, which they can talk about in a bit. But first, before we get into that, I feel we need to provide a general overview of what Black Futures is all about. So as you can see on the slide, it's a series of programs using the lens of the genre of Afrofuturism to explore and present arts, dialogue, and well-being here at Hart House. So a couple of questions to keep in mind here. What will the future bring for Black women, men, and children? Who is responsible for Black futures, shifting narratives, flipping experiences, and crafting new realities? Hart House explores the idea of Afrofuturism as a way to blend the knowledge of the past with a reimagining of the future. A showcase of intersectional arts and dialogue, the series aims to reflect the experiences of today's Black leaders and artists while providing a platform for real-world knowledge to help students be future-ready, self-aware, and empowered citizens as they move into their imagined realities. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce our three excellent author panelists for today, or rather allow them to introduce themselves, beginning with Antoine Bandele.
This is the part where I can unmute myself and reveal myself, correct?
Yeah.
Hey, my name is Antoine. So yeah, I am a YouTuber and author of mostly Black speculative literature. Some of it is kind of the old-timey, like pre-colonial African fantasy stuff, and then I also have contemporary as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Antoine. And next we have Stephanie Chrisman.
Hey everybody, my name is Stephanie Chrisman. I'm an Afrofuturist author, political scientist, nationally recognized journalist and essayist. I utilize Afrofuturism primarily to explore social justice and dismantling oppression. But I'm also a huge geek who loves Legos, movies, and gaming. So, and I checked out your YouTube, and it's amazing. Let's just say that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Nice to have you with us, Stephanie. And last but certainly not least, a good family friend of mine, Rashid Mohiddin.
Hey there. I'm Rashid Mohiddin. I'm sort of a bartender, but mostly the founder and editor of two indie magazines here in Toronto. And I love history, and a lot of my focus is on decolonizing history and trying to kind of like recapture how we've been told our stories to chart a course forward that may be a little less restricted.
Awesome. Thanks so much to all three of our panelists. So with that out of the way, I feel before we launch into the discussion, it is helpful to get a bit of a grounding, especially for those who may be unfamiliar with some of the terms we'll be discussing. So we have a few slides to that effect where we can establish a few terms and perhaps lay a nice foundation for us to launch into our discussion. So I think we're just getting the slideshow ready for that. And this is also a nice time for me to let you know that the auto captions are on. So if you can see that creepy thing at the bottom right there, that's transcribing everything I'm saying. That is for your benefit. I'm trying not to look at it too much because it's freaking me out. But you've got to love how Zoom is that advanced. Anyhow, so one of the words in this event title was the world building of Wakanda. So I feel it's necessary that we briefly go over what world building means. It's something you've all probably heard in the context of sci-fi and fantasy, and it's become sort of lingua franca more recently. But for those of you who may not know, in the simplest possible way I could describe it, I think world building describes making a fictional world as realistic as possible. Now, when we talk about realistic, we don't necessarily mean realism. It doesn't mean that the world has to adhere to all the laws or scientific principles or everything that we keep in mind in our world. No, it just means it has to have a certain machinery and consistency in its own right. However, the degrees of that can differ depending on the author's intent and what kind of sci-fi and or fantasy world they want to construct. But I summed it all up in this nice pithy little axiom here. You don't need the laws of physics to explain psychics. So I think that pretty much sums up the idea of internal consistency when it comes to world building. And on top of that, there are a few sort of corollary terms to keep in mind when we talk about different types of world building. So this idea of hard and soft world building, and sort of put as dichotomous opposites, but it's really more of a spectrum, just like with many things. So when we talk about harder world building, it's usually involving a unique set of properties, rules, and specific principles by which a fictional world operates. So more of that mechanical, automated, orderly type of fictional world that you would imagine in certain fantasy franchises, compared to softer world building, which is a little more whimsical, more about escapism and creating a spectacular world over creating a super plausible and consistent world. And it's worth noting that neither one of these is objectively better than the other. These are simply just two different ways that authors can approach world building, whether it be in sci-fi or fantasy. And part and parcel in that is this idea of secondary world fiction, which is sci-fi fantasy set in a world that's distinctly different from ours rather than some vision of it. So these are just some basic terms I feel it's helpful to keep in mind when we get into our discussion about Wakanda. So now we got world building out of the way, I feel it's also incumbent to talk about Afrofuturism, the other buzzword in the title. And I will say right now, Stephanie designed these excellent slides for me, so I just want to give a shout out to her. And there are a lot of quotes here from renowned scholars and authors in the genre. And I feel like they'll give us a good picture of what we can expect. So this first one here, Afrofuturism is an exploration and methodology of liberation, simultaneously both a location and a journey. I think that's a really interesting way to envision it, and it'll stack up well with some other definitions we have here. Take a look at this one. The descendants of alien abductees inhabiting a sci-fi nightmare in which an unseen but no less impossible force field of intolerance frustrates their movements, whilst official histories undo what has been done. What I particularly like about this definition is just the very terminology here: alien abductees, sci-fi nightmare, impossible force fields. All this terminology that we see as synonymous with the very sci-fi genre being repurposed to describe a very specific demographic and cultural experience, which I think, in my opinion, is really sort of the heart of the genre of Afrofuturism, and which our panelists can talk about more in depth. Some more scholarly authority here. We have Adrian Marie Brown, who's considered a flagship writer and critic in the genre. She says, if we want worlds that work more for us more, we have to have more of us involved in the visioning process. So this idea of imagination to create a better world, which again is a central precept, we can say, of Afrofuturism, and one of the ways, and perhaps it's a more educated or educative genre, and one that's important to keep in mind if we're talking about social progress. What's interesting about this term Afrofuturism is that it was not coined by a Black author initially, but by a white author, Mark Derry, in his essay called Black to the Future in this collection called Flame Wars, The Discourse of Cyberpunk. And he originally used the term to describe the works of authors like Samuel Delany and Octavia Butler. So again, this wide umbrella under which we can group sword and sorcery works, which is more where Samuel Delany liked to play with, versus Octavia Butler, who delved into both sci-fi and fantasy. But the commonality between all these, at least from Delany's initial understanding and perspective, was that these authors wrote from a particular position, of course, that being Black, but it also played with different identities, whether that be queer sensibilities in Delany's case, or particular socioeconomic circumstances. But above all, from his perception here, Derry sort of saw Afrofuturism and sci-fi as a vehicle for Black authors to truly narrate the Black experience of their ancestors and descendants. However, as we will get into later, the term has definitely taken on different connotations under Black authors, and perhaps repurposed to a certain extent, but it'll be interesting to get our panelists' take on that. Just a few closing thoughts here, some nice axioms. Afrofuturism can provide a new language to address the increasingly complicated frameworks of discrimination. It's one of the best benefits of it. But additionally, there's a need for more analysis of the relationships between race, sexuality, gender, technology, and the utopian impulses of those marked as deviant. And finally, the erasure of the other from futuristic societies and imaginings in sci-fi is an example of the invisibility that we face in contemporary society. So these are three things that are important to keep in mind when we're discussing the genre. And I had a slide here. I don't know where it's gone, but if you're looking for non-literary applications for Afrofuturism, perhaps more musical examples, there are things like the group Earth, Wind, and Fire, and even artists like Janelle Monáe, who implement imagery from Egyptian mythology in their music videos, album cover, and things like that. So it's a very wide-ranging genreic field through which we can view many things, whether it be written works in genre or musical styles, and a nice eclectic mix of things. Of course, when you ask the average person for an example of Afrofuturism, they will probably say Black Panther and Wakanda, hence the focus of our discussion here. So we feel just before we launch into the discussion that we play this brief video for you all, just to refresh our knowledge on Wakanda, set the terrain. So we're going to play that right now. So enjoy, folks.
$2.5 million years ago, a meteorite crashed deep within the lush green forests and plains of East Africa. This meteorite brought with it a strange new element with astonishing properties, vibranium, and it altered the very flora and fauna around it. Throughout the centuries, the landscape was transformed by its presence, until it had become a place without equal across the entirety of the Earth. 5 tribes settled the region, discovering and claiming this wealth as their own. To the outside world, this nation is only another third world country, unstable and stricken by poverty. But beneath the protection of a technologically advanced cloaking field, there lies the secret jewel of Africa, the Kingdom of Wakanda. Bordered by Uganda, South Sudan, and Kenya, this small country has neither garnered nor sought any significant attention on the international stage. Though the kingdom has embassies around the globe, the country has very little economic or strategic value to the rest of the world. This, however, is a carefully constructed ruse, for Wakanda is, in actuality, the most technologically advanced nation on the planet. The presence of vibranium, a rarity elsewhere, has allowed the Wakandans to develop sophisticated agricultural, military, medical, and scientific achievements, ensuring that every citizen has an incredibly high quality of life. A hereditary monarchy, Wakanda's king is bestowed the title of Black Panther, so named for the first to unite the tribes of Wakanda. Each tribe has at its head an elder to serve on the king's council, bringing each tribe's perspective on matters of state and allowing open discussion and debate. Ultimately, however, the king is solely responsible for the governance of his country and must prove himself worthy of the responsibility. On the day of his coronation, the king presents himself at the Warrior Falls, an ancient site where questions of leadership are decided. Any tribe who deems the ruler unfit to lead has the right to name a challenger. This challenger must best the ruler in ritual combat, ensuring the leader of Wakanda will always have the strength to lead the nation. For centuries, the kings of Wakanda have come from the Panther tribe, also known as the Golden Tribe. As the ruling family, most of their members are trained in leadership and academic roles. The remaining tribes have likewise come to inherit distinct roles in Wakandan society. The Border Tribe is responsible for the protection of Wakanda, ensuring no outsider could enter without being first invited. They live primarily in the mountainous regions of the country's edge, and embody simple lives of farming and hunting, as well as breeding the formidable white rhinoceros for use in battle. Some families within the Border Tribe live outside the cloaking field, and their deceptively simple lives lead credence to the idea that Wakanda is primitive and poverty-stricken, keeping foreign eyes away. The Mining Tribe is responsible for the extraction of the alien metal vibranium from the earth, and it remains Wakanda's most valuable resource. The Merchant and River Tribes then trade and refine these resources, making up the bulk of the Wakandan economy. The only tribe to not have a seat on the tribal council is the Jabari, also known as the Mountain Tribe. A fierce group dedicated to the ape god Hanuman, they rejected the rule of the Panther tribe and retreated to the high mountain regions, further isolating themselves from the rest of the world. Military power in Wakanda is divided between the Border Tribe and the Hatuzaraze, which translates to the Dogs of War. While the Border Tribe is in charge of national security, the War Dogs serve as a kind of secret police and intelligence agency, with many agents stationed all over the world, from Nigeria to the United States of America. Every War Dog is marked with a tattoo on the inside of their lip, ensuring that war dogs can easily identify each other when in the field. The reigning Black Panther has a contingent of bodyguards known as the Dora Milaje. This all-female special forces group escorts the king on all his missions outside the country, providing security and support. They specialize in the spear and hand-to-hand combat, and can be readily identified by their shaved heads. In the time before Wakanda was united, the 5 tribes were at constant war with one another for resources and martial supremacy. It is said that the first Black Panther, Bashenga, was guided by the panther goddess Bast to a powerful heart-shaped herb, mutated by the vibranium around it. Once ingested, this flower allowed Bashenga to travel to the ancestral plane, where he was granted superhuman strength and abilities, through which he was able to unite all the tribes, with the exception of the Jabari. This flower is still used in the Warrior Falls ritual, with each new Black Panther given a tea brewed from its petals after his victory. These flowers are protected and cared for by shamans, who oversee all religious and spiritual ceremonies within Wakanda. Wakanda's longtime isolationist policies were uprooted, however, when an unexpected challenger arrived at Warrior Falls. Ndjaka, cousin to the current Black Panther T'Challa and better known by his American name Eric Killmonger Stevens, defeated T'Challa in single combat, becoming the newest king of Wakanda. Seeking revenge for the centuries of oppression Africans have faced throughout history, Ndjaka began sending vibranium weapons and supplies across the world in preparation for an assault on the Earth's most powerful nations. The resulting civil war and conflict between Ndjaka and the resurrected T'Challa ended with the loss of many Wakandan lives, though T'Challa did honor Ndjaka's wish to open the Wakandan borders and help their brothers and sisters across the world. With Wakanda beginning to share its knowledge and technology, there had grown a spark of hope that the once ignored nations of Africa might have found greater prominence on the international stage. Cosmic events have shattered these dreams. A battle fought and lost on the plains of Wakanda has rocked the very fabric of reality, with half of all life now gone, perhaps forever. The Templin Institute investigates alternate worlds and realities. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to directly support us, vote in polls to determine future topics, and receive some cool rewards, please consider pledging.
So I should say that this video came out before Avengers Endgame did, so spoiler alert for the 3 of you who probably haven't seen that movie yet. Things worked out in the end, sort of. If only all our real world problems could be solved by the snap of a finger, but such as it is. So now I think that video gave a nice intricate overview of some of the world building aspects of Wakanda. So now we can launch into our discussion with a little more context. So first off, I just wanted to ask each of our panelists, since Black Panther and Wakanda is a franchise that stretches back to at least the mid-60s, so it's been around for quite a bit, even if the movies have only gained popularity within recent years. So I'm curious to hear from each one of you. When did you sort of first discover Black Panther and the world of Wakanda? And sort of how did you feel upon immersing yourselves in this setting for the first time? And maybe Antoine, we could start with you.
So I was always familiar with it, but I'm not a big comic book person, so I didn't really interact with it much. The most I did was usually movies, and that was like stuff like Meteor Man and Blank Man, which most people don't really remember those 90s Black films. I mean, people remember Spawn because that was pretty big, but not like Meteor Man was my stuff like back in the day. And it wasn't until the movie that I started looking into some of the comic books, some of the novels that were out of it too, because I typically like to read novels. It's like my favorite kind of medium to interact with. But it wasn't until the movie that I realized like what it was in a big way.
Awesome, yeah, and I know Antoine has a great video where he discusses his sort of personal experience with Black superhero movies leading up to Black Panther. So definitely check that out, folks. How about you, Stephanie?
Yeah, I also wasn't super into comic books when I was growing up, but I think the first time I had ever heard of Black Panther was in relationship to Storm. And so, because I guess there was a romance there, so I was really kind of into Storm during the X-Men cartoon days. And so, so I kind of heard about Black Panther from there. But then when the movie came out, that's when I was like, oh, wow, you know, let's think more about this. I was already kind of in the process of doing my own writing and that kind of thing. So, so yeah, and then kind of watching the movie was just like, whoa, this is so amazing. Just feeling myself being connected to the characters just right away, and the kind of wild possibility of a nation that hadn't been colonialized. You know what I'm saying? So
I would like to see
yeah.
the piggyback off of that, because that was a huge thing for me too, because most of the, to talk about the video that you mentioned that I did, that the difference between Black Panther and the other ones that I watched before that, because we had Blade, we had Meteor Man, we had Blink Man, we had a bunch of, you know, and Spawn, we had black superheroes, Static Shock, but the difference with this one is that it was set in Africa and it was unapologetically African.
Exactly.
And that was what the significance of Black Panther was to me in particular. Just wanted to piggyback on that because I thought that was a really good point you made.
Oh no, that's so true. That's so true. Yep.
Yeah, awesome. And please do feel free to just interject whenever you want. There's no like strict order here, so I want to hear everyone's thoughts. If you're just dying to say something, please let it be known. But Stephanie, you brought up an interesting point with Storm, because they're sort of like, I don't think they're still together, but they were like a power couple in the Marvel universe for a while. So it was really pretty cool. But yeah, sorry, you had further thoughts to share, Stephanie.
Oh no, I was just wondering what Rashid was gonna say.
Oh yeah, well, like I think you mentioned, like, mentioning Storm is interesting, because like when I moved to Canada as a 10-year-old, I kind of dove headfirst into Western culture to try to like ingratiate myself to where I was. And like superhero movies appealed to me, like you know, Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man and all that kind of stuff, and the original X-Men with Hugh Jackman, and like Storm was kind of the only POC. And then even when they started rolling out like the Iron Mans and stuff, you know, like the black dude was always a sidekick. And that was kind of like always the shtick, was like, you're the sidekick, you're here to help. And like that was kind of refracted through our culture in general. So there was like a slow move over the last like 15 years towards the space that allowed us to have something like Black Panther. And like honestly, like I saw the movie twice in theaters. The first time I saw it, there's like a flyover scene right when they're going to Wakanda through like some like nomadic pastoralists or whatever, and like that's like an image that like I've seen, because like I spent part of my childhood in Africa and East Africa and West Africa, and like that's an image I would have seen in my childhood, and it genuinely made me cry. Like I fucking cried in the theaters, like tears streaming down my face, just like holy shit. Like I didn't know how much that meant to me until I actually saw it, and like it was set to like a rhythmic tribal soundtrack too. And then like in it, like if you watch the movie again, you'll notice that like there's a beat the whole time. It's a subtle beat, but it's a subtle drum beat because the movie is a rhythm, you know, and that's something that you don't normally get in like I'm just gonna call it white movies, you know.
Well,
so
to
like,
go back to the introduction of Wakanda, like as a historian in particular, I kind of made that kind of analogy to kind of the Mali Empire in Mansa Musa, because it's very similar. The idea of like, you know, you're trying to hold on to something that's going to be coveted by the world.
The city of gold, right?
Right. So yeah, he was like the lord of the mines, the gold mines and the salt mines. And so he went through, you know, North Africa and into Arabia to just giving away gold and like bringing down the value of gold in Egypt for a time.
Right.
And then, you know, you see European maps with like this one guy who has like a gold piece. And it's like, it's that same idea of like Wakanda, you know, like the protection of that. And like, hey, there's more to Africa than just like, you know, just this huge desert or like jungle and stuff like that, you know? So I thought that was an interesting idea, especially when you get to Wakanda, you actually do see some structures that are from like, you know, Mali or like Timbuktu. Like they had a lot of those adaptations I thought were really cool.
Well, that was a really neat part of how they developed that world, was they kind of like pulled little bits of cultures all over the continent to try and do this kind of like Pan-Africanist vision. Like, you know, Kwame Nkrumah is like so happy this happened. Where and like the thing is, like, while on the one hand it's wonderful to be able to have this Pan-Africanism, on the other hand it's like that's kind of like step one. So then that gives us the space to now actually start to talk about the diversity of the African continent, you know.
I'm very glad you mentioned that, because it's entirely and that, but that's good though, because you do kind of need that funnel, right? You need the funnel of like, here's the broad strokes, and now we're starting to get more specific things when we're having things like Children of Blood and Bone, which is very much about the Orishas and West Africa, and then you have other things coming. I think what was the one Disney announced, Awanju? I can't remember what it was called, but that's also doing very specific kind of things. There was one called Kariba, which was a South African. Like you get to get more of that now because Black Panther has sort of opened the floodgates for that.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
And it's like it's the kind of thing that's really, really inspiring to creators as well, because it's shown us, like, it's given us more examples than we could have ever dreamed of, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And just thinking about like the ways in which and I know we're going to talk about it a little bit later probably, but just thinking about so many different things that came up within the movie, just thinking about the ways in which women were like a upfront and important piece of the story, that this idea of a tension of which for me was very important around Blackness, this tension of, do we allow people into this, amazingly wonderful Black space, white people in particular? Do we let other people who are not a part of our group into this particular space? I mean, and that's very, even within our own kind of working in a modern real world, is something that we have to think about a lot. Especially in a world that is very covetous of our, of our culture, the Black diaspora and specifically.
Well, it's interesting because in the movie there's that one scene with little Hobbit Mans who gets, like, he's hurt, he's brought in, and then Shuri's like, oh great, like another white boy for us to fix. Yeah. And I thought that was like, it was a reference to something later on, but like, I thought that was like that wasn't just like a coded reference within the Marvel universe. That was like very much a coded reference at what it is that Black culture does to whiteness, which is, we're here to fix your problems again.
Exactly.
I think you all touch. I think you. Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of touches upon another really interesting point that we've all sort of addressed, like the very compositional nature of Wakanda. So on the one hand, you have all this futurism and advanced technology and all this wealth, but you also have a deep reverence for tradition, a certain cultural authenticity, Pan-Africanism, whatever term you'd like to use to describe it, and just the hybridity of those two things. So I'm curious to sort of hear from all of you, how do you think those two aspects are balanced when it comes to Wakanda's world building, and maybe how does that speak to the genre of Afrofuturism as a whole? Maybe Antoine, you want to go ahead?
Well, I love the idea of that, because even like some of the concept art that we were watching during the video, you see how buildings are sort of built around the environment rather than over it, or like demolishing it, which is, there's a term for, I think it's ecology or ecologic, I don't know what it's called, but it's like the melding of, infrastructure with the natural environment. You see that a lot in like fantasy with like elves and stuff like that. They'll build the tree houses around their trees instead of like, taking the trees down. So I think that idea of it is really nice. And also, the two worlds of holding on to the old traditions, but then still being the progressive forefront of progress in terms of like technology or anything like that. I think it's represented very well with Wakanda. And also in the idea of Afrofuturism, the idea of how we can move forward, and hold on, to what we have without demolishing it or erasing it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think about when I read, was specifically when I read this conversation or this question, but also just in trying to think of like, okay, how would, what could I compare Wakanda to, or like what my vision of Wakanda would be like? And I have to say, it's kind of weird, but I thought of Black Twitter as like this mirror of Wakanda. You have millions of Black people all over the world utilizing Twitter to have these conversations. And we say Black Twitter because a lot of times it's a lot of things that are very much connected to Blackness, and not just Blackness unique to the US, but Blackness across the diaspora, right? And so you have this really technologically advanced system to have this conversation with one another about stuff that that we find interesting, that we find funny, that impacts who we are as a people, you know, all of that kind of thing. And I imagine that that's how it would be in Wakanda, where you have these different folks with all of these different types of beliefs, you know, whether it's deeply embedded in tradition or hyper, you know, advanced technology. You have these people kind of mingling with one another and really having these deep conversations. And then the question is, what often happens with white Twitter is that some things are stolen for the greater, larger population of whiteness, right? And how does then Black Twitter continue to maintain itself in a way that allows protection for the language, for the vision, for all of those kinds of things? And it really does. And so I imagine that, and for me, that's kind of what I imagine how Wakanda would be in some way when we see eventually it open up to the world. We're going to keep a lot of this to ourselves. You get about 5%.
That's what I'm really interested in. I want to see how they're going to be doing that, because it just got announced that the Wakanda series anthology that Ryan Coogler got greenlit is going to happen. So it's very interesting to see how the future, because it kind of got stopped, you know, with the whole snapping thing, right? We didn't really get that storyline because the whole world kind of like stopped for a second. But yeah, how is that going to look like? And I think that's a pretty big responsibility on those creators of how they're going to depict that, because it is going to send a message sort of how we think the real world, you know, should kind of navigate from this point on.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Well, like that does kind of touch on like a lot of things, kind of what like it kind of speaks to how Wakanda would or would not navigate colonialism, for one, and how it would navigate a post-colonial era, and also like what role do Africans have in a world that's done nothing but take from Africa. Like I remember watching the movie feeling like, yeah, they're right to be hiding away. They're right to be hiding away, like knowing my history, knowing, you know, that 500 plus years of exactly. So I'm with you, Antoine. I think it's fascinating to see where they're going to take it moving forward, and how they chart it in this world. Like one of the more interesting things I thought about, like the way they created their world, was like the intertribal cooperation, and kind of like how they can navigate that in the world we're in today that doesn't necessarily value that. But yeah, the thing about tradition and futurism is fascinating, though. Like I feel like that's a tension that just like cuts through like every society in a variety of ways. But it's like, I think it's particularly acute in Western culture, because like mass white culture has done a really good job of erasing history, like both the kind of like sides they weren't necessarily proud of, but also like the indigenous people here in Canada. And it's like, without tradition, how do you have a future, right? Like I've got a quote here where it's like, you look back to look forward. Like that's kind of like how we progress as a society and a civilization as people, right? So we look back, you know, look at the ancestors, what have they done, and move forward with whatever's going on today. But by destroying the past, like where can we go? So it's definitely like a wild tension. I think it's really interesting that most indigenous cultures, because I'd like to group like Afrofuturism within the tradition of indigeneity, because these are global responses to a system that was foisted on everyone that does not speak to the lived realities of most people around the world. So like Antoine, your point about like architecture, the first thing I thought of was this like, I think it was Human Planet, not Planet Earth, from like a decade ago. These like dudes in India who were like growing a bridge that took like 1,000 years to grow because it was literally a tree across a river. Like it's a tree bridge that they like, and it's like this dude's job was to like look after this bridge. And I'm thinking like, whoa, my guy, like you're like literally you're not going to see anything happen. The tree's never going to grow visibly in your lifetime, but somehow you've like managed to convince yourself that this is like this is what you're doing with your life. Whereas here in like our culture, we're like, no, you must achieve, accomplish, do things now. And like this guy just like got this tree going across a river, and it's like that's a really, really interesting way of interpreting like architecture and being in the world, you know?
Definitely.
I actually like this comment that's right here. Are we okay to like mention comments if they pop up?
I think it was the question comment, I believe. So
it wasn't a question. It was just it was in the panelists and attendees. The gentleman here about the medium of film.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So
I thought it was an interesting point.
Just before you answer that, I think it's a great question, but I just want to tell the attendees, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A function. That way it'll be a lot easier, because otherwise things get lost in the chat because people like to contribute. So if you do have a question for the panelists, I think this one is a really good one. Then just feel free to put it in the Q&A. But yeah, Antoine, go ahead.
Oh yeah. So he says, does the medium of film bring the vision closer to life compared to previous textbooks or graphic novels and cartoon mediums? And I thought that was interesting in particular because we were talking about the idea of oral tradition and how we're kind of, because of visual mediums like film and TV, we're kind of reverting back to that, but with technology, right? So it's still like in the play of the Afrofuturism, where it's like, that is our first way of understanding story or sharing stories, and text is kind of a newer thing. It's kind of like a middle portion of human history, and now we're kind of reverting back to that, because as you can see with most people, you know, they go to, even me being a novelist, like it's like, yeah, most people are like, when's the movie, or like what's the TV adaptation? Like people are always asking for like the video, where's the visual, that sort of a thing. And I thought it was very interesting. And I think the importance of that, I want to touch on like the importance of film because of that reason. And for whatever reason, it's more engaging for us to interact with, you know, visual, auditorial mediums.
Well, it's kind of where podcasts come in too, right?
Right.
And like, I think that's like a really, really interesting opportunity moving forward for like Afrofuturist voices, right? Where like with the podcast, you're just telling a story. You're just telling a story in your voice, with your tone, with your, you know, if you get a good sound editor, then you you can really, really create an immersive experience.
Or audiobook, similar, you know, where you have like sound effects and music, like very similar to old griots who would have, you know, the music playing in the background while they're doing the story. It's full circle.
Exactly, because like, you know, for thousands of years, how are we telling stories? It was around the fire with like crackling in the background, chattering in the background, maybe some drum beats. Like that's how it always was. It was about like not just like it's totally like really wild to me that like for, you know, like since the white people decided that we must read and write, and that's like the objective truth is written and read. It's been like 200 years since they decided that. Like all they've done is give us these fucking books that are just like words on pages, words on pages, words on pages, words on pages. And you're like, okay, true. Like, that's not how I learn. Like, I'm literally gonna like hold up a friggin' book here. And it's like, like, what is this? What is this madness? You know, like that is in no way like engaging to the human, unless you're like a very specific type of human that's like a small minority of people that can internalize like, you know, information that way, right? So the fact that we're in a space now where we can actually communicate these messages across all the like borders the way we can, it's really, really empowering, you know?
Definitely. I think what I love that question too, because for me, I always think about the ways in which, you know, which you brought up too, Rashid, was like, how do we learn? Like we, you know, I feel like I definitely learn through visuals. And I think that although I'm a huge reader and an author as well, and so it's like, when people are like, hey, so like you were saying, Antoine, about like movies, it's mostly like, hey, when is it going to be a, you know, audiobook? It's like, not anytime soon. That's expensive. But, you know, just like we have this world where people are moving so fast. And so books are not, they're becoming this really novel thing now, which is so weird.
Literally, no.
It's like you have a book? Yes, I actually have this piece of paper, the bunch of papers folded together. Yes, I actually have that. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with film, because I love film. I think it's amazing, but I do think that there are places for that type of medium. But I do also think, because me and Rashid were talking about this earlier, you know, how do we capture the stories that will never get a moment to have their moment on film, right? How do we capture? And really it is about writing and taking the time to kind of, you know, help this narrative move forward, because there's so many people who, you know, we have these histories with that will never get that opportunity. And that's what makes, I think, Wakanda so amazing, because it feels like there's not only technology, but as you all were talking about, this oral tradition that's going to keep going because of the technology, which is sort of strange, but it's like Clubhouse to some extent, if any of you are on Clubhouse. But so it's like all this, you know, narrative, this verbal narrative, and, you know, no images, which is kind of cool.
It's kind of like lyrics too in a song, right? Like if you just read it without knowing what the song is or what the music is or anything like that, if you just read it, sometimes it's kind of like, okay, like cool words, you know, but then once you get the performer behind it, it's a whole different kind of scenario. Similar with people who say they don't understand Shakespeare when they read it, but when it's performed and you're like, oh, even though you don't understand the words maybe completely, you get the meaning behind them because there's someone giving it life. So there is that benefit of that portion of it.
Well, it's because there's like a thousand ways to learn, right? And you know, I think part of what we're doing as Afrofuturist authors, historians, researchers, and like students is like we're telling stories the way we want to tell them, which is really powerful because we were told stories a certain way. Yeah, there's only one way to learn, right? It's like, you know, you sit in that desk, take notes, and you follow the instructions. And like we're touching on how there's actually way more different ways to do that. And you know, the important thing is to kind of build on that tradition now, right? Where, you know, we're more empowered than we've ever been. So it's kind of like it's time to build from that. Like how do we empower more people? How do we have more people who believe they can tell stories their way? And how do we make it legitimate, right? Like where do we get legitimacy from for this, right? Because like the schools still have their way of educating people. You still got to go along their treadmill to get their pieces of paper their way, you know?
And that reminds me of an earlier conversation that you and I had, Rashid, about like history is so freaking amazing. Like history is amazing. It's bloody, it's sad, it's tragic, it's amazing. It's like there's love, there's hate, there's all kinds of things in it, and all people usually get are like names and dates. Like,
right, it's stories, it's not names and dates.
It's just like names and dates, not anything about what actually happened. How did this unfold? You know, I mean, and none of that.
The reason it unfolded, like that, you know, all that.
You know, none of that. I mean, it's just like, you know,
this man did this thing this one time, and then this man did this thing, and then this man did this thing. But it's like the histories that we were taught, and this is like basically a global problem. Like it's like there's a collective global issue here. History was taught to all of us by white men who were born in the 1800s in either England, Germany, France, or the United States of America. Those four countries, white men born in those places wrote down the histories of everybody and then told us that's what the game is. The game is like, this is like BBC Africa thing. It's like a 10-part documentary series in the history of Africa. I'm like partway through it right now. The episode on Egypt was wicked. And like it opens with this, like, it's like, look, like the ancient Egyptians were black. Like don't have a two ways. They were black. They were black, they were black, they were black. And like get it out of your mind that they were even close to brown, let alone white. They were black. Like all of the first kings of Egypt for the first like 1,000 years were from south. They were from the south of Egypt. And then like, you know, layered another point, like Egypt did not become a multicultural Mediterranean society until, you know, the Greeks and Romans got there thousands of years later. And that's why they're brown now. And I'm like, yep, okay, yep, that tracks. And then they're like, yeah, so when you look at the pyramids, like the way they would like the hieroglyphs, right? They'd like draw, like when they were like drawing on the walls, the red ochre paint they were using, that was how they expressed tones of blackness. red ochre paint. When you look at it, there's shades of red ochreness, and that's for the blackness. So it's like, of course, the fucking white men in the 1800s who were writing down these histories were like, nah. They, at minimum, they had to be like Arab looking brown. There's no way the Egyptians were black.
Right.
You know, like that's why we have to, like, you know, decolonize our histories.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and when you have history books being kind of written in the US with this ideology of like, Black folks were immigrants and they came to help with it. It's like, no, there were Black people from, you know, East Africa who were enslaved, right?
Yeah, I've never seen that before. That's crazy.
It's also like this like giant like amnesiac shame almost.
Yeah.
Of like Africa has like in the 150 years or so of like teaching people what the hell the world is, Africa's been kind of created as this avatar to project all of our fears and anxieties onto. And it's not a real place, it's an imagined place in our minds, like Africa. And part of it is shameful. Like Africa can't be capable of anything. You know, that's why the Egyptians can't be Black. You can't have a great civilization from Africa. That's not allowed. No. Africa's where we take stuff from. And like there was a really big thing, like I was like reading up on Marcus Garvey, and it's like he was taught to hate Africa and to be ashamed of being from Africa. You know, it's like he that's crazy. It's
I mean, I think that relates just back to what Stephanie was saying earlier, why Wakanda is so novel. It's because, of course, it's a nation that's been untouched by these atrocities like colonialism and slavery. So I think that's perhaps a good segue, and what Rashid was already signaling at, to discuss maybe how Wakanda specifically subverts these unhelpful and harmful stereotypes that we usually associate with Africa, whether economically or socially or historically, and perhaps how Wakanda can serve as inspiration for other fictional settings there.
No, it's like it really does provide a challenge to this like conception we have for, you know, what I was taught in the dark continent, you know, and like what Africa can do in a war. Is like part of this, like one of the things I'm working on right now is a story about my family. My dad's side of the family from East Africa, and we're Swahilis, and within the framework of like, you know, ethno-nationalism, my dad's Kenyan. Like my dad was my age, Kenya just became a country. In the country of Kenya, there's 44 million people. The Swahilis, who are a small little tribe, and 200,000 Swahilis. You know, the dominant ethnic group there, the Kikuyus, is like, you know, something like 19 million or something, right? Like we are just a drop in the water of, you know, dozens and dozens of different ethnic groups in this country called Kenya. And like that's like a really, really fascinating reality for African countries to kind of like confront. And Wakanda's definitely given them, I wouldn't say, I'd say like a bit of hope for sure, and like a potential roadmap, right? Where it's like, look, this is a multi-ethnic state that does work. We can, like, because we basically been given all these nation states that have to be multi-ethnic without a roadmap that says this is how it works. And like
it's very similar to Nigeria too, where Nigeria has a bunch of ethnic groups, and you would think, you look at a map, oh no, Nigeria is all Nigerian. It's like, no, there's like I think dozens and dozens of ethno groups. I mean, there's like three major ones. There's the Igbo, there's the Yoruba, and then the House of Fulani. But like, there's multiple, and you can't just put a, you know, imaginary line around that. And even splitting some of those people groups, you know, with those borders, and expect them to, you know, get along. Like they have different traditions and different kinds of cultures. It's not like you can just group them.
Yeah, it's wild. It's like the way I love to describe it is like if anyone's familiar with former Yugoslavia in Europe. Like former Yugoslavia, where you've got Bosnia, Serbia, and like and then like Croatia, Slovenia, and like, you know, something like 8-10 different countries in this area, like that they fought for their ethno-nationalist nation states, and they've now got their like if you look at the African map, you've got Swaziland, you've got Lesotho, you've got Namibia,
as like, or not Botswana, which are like almost ethno-nationalist, like as in like they have the one ethnicity that's in the whole.
Their borders are actually, appropriate.
Like, on the other hand, you could take Rwanda, which has two ethnic groups, and we saw how that turned out, right? And like the thing is, it's like the nation state is something that the Europeans created in Europe for Europeans, and they fought for it in Europe against each other for their rights to have nation states for themselves. And then they went to the rest of the world and they're like, hey, world, how about it? How about you have this? Like, hey, Middle East, how about that? Hey, Southeast Asia, how about that? Hey, India, how's it going? Like, it's it's one of the tragedies of history, but it's also given the global, the non-Western world a really, really tremendous opportunity to imagine a better world. And that's the thing that I'm like really, really inspired by. Like I was reading up on the history of the Swahili Coast last week, and like essentially if colonialism didn't happen and say the Swahilis were allowed to form a nation state in the way that the Europeans were, the Swahili Coast stretches from Somalia all the way down to Mozambique. And it would be a country it would look like Chile, just on the east coast of Africa, because culturally everyone up and down that coast was trading with people in India, in China, and Arabia. Like that's kind of like what it would have been. So it's fascinating for me to kind of like try and reimagine worlds like that, and how different the world could be, because part of the Swahili part of the Swahili state was really multicultural. It was like everyone was from everywhere, and that was part of the agreement, part of the ethic. It was like, yeah. It's like, oh yeah, you're from like Philippines, cool. Oh, you're from Indonesia, cool. Or like what would have been Malay, or I guess it's like that's an example of how the world can be. Whereas like the Europeans who created these things were like, yeah, bro, like this is France for the French, this is Belgium for the Belgians. What's a Belgian? Like, you know what I mean? It's an opportunity here.
Right. And in thinking about that, it's like, this is one of the tensions sometimes between Afrofuturists who spend most of their time or grew up in Africa versus Afrofuturists who live in other parts of the diaspora, and particularly in the US. There is an occasional tension around if we're talking about Afrofuturism, does that mean that all of your work should be placed within Africa, right? The continent of Africa. And for me, while Wakanda was beautiful, and I thought so much about like what would this look like for, a country in the continent to have not been touched by colonialism? What would that look like even for the whole continent if it had not been touched by colonialism? But I mean, in my imagination, I can only go as far as Wakanda, right? Because I've never lived in Africa. I have no connection other than through maybe friends or through what I've, seen on television, both the really propagandist kind of, stuff that you see late at night about, you have to give this $1 and all of that kind of stuff, to the actual, somewhat, the actual reality of what the African continent has in terms of, wealth, in terms of, people and all of that kind of stuff. So I can only imagine so much in terms of Wakanda, but in my own work, in my own society, I have to imagine a world where I grew up. That doesn't mean I can't stretch my mind, but I can't really even imagine something that would place me within an African context, because I've never been there, right? I've never been there. I've never lived there. And so I don't know, right? And so I think that that's an interesting tension, because when we're thinking about, what would it look like if Africa wasn't touched by colonialism? Well, what would it look like for me as a Black American if, for instance, Tulsa remained unburned, if Rosewood remained unburned, if all of these, if Harlem remained, essential to like a Black community, like how would that look for me, right? And I think that that's where for me, you begin to write around, kind of breaking through these kind of stereotypes and all of that kind of stuff. And that's what we can do, for me, an exchange of knowledge on what would it look like if these areas of the US had not been trampled on by white racism, right? Versus having a conversation with someone who is from the continent, and they can say, yeah, you know, this is how I imagine my space, not having been colonialized, right? So I think that there's an opportunity for an exchange of conversation. And I think in some ways, Black Panther kind of opened that. Yeah, it kind of opened that.
And it's kind of been in throughout the history of like Black Americans in particular, it's kind of been that way because we've had to remix what our ancestors have done already. So that's either through music or language, for instance. Like Ebonics is, well, I don't even know if it's called Ebonics anymore. I think it's AAVE now, I think is the term for it. But it's the idea of that was our previous grammar, and we're just adapting it to this new language. Or similar religions, like the religions of Ifa coming and integrating with Catholicism and becoming like, oh, the saints are also the Orishas at the same time. Like we always are remixing it, or even just any of the patois or the Creole that's all over. You know, that's all just hints of our history that are just being implanted and remixed, and that's kind of how we've been navigating, you know, being in the diaspora, is just remixing what are, and even though if we don't know it actively, it's still in our bloodline, or even in the way that, you know, we talk, or the way that we interact with each other, or some of the culture stuff that we have are just carryovers. And it's just good to remind ourselves that we're just trying to, and have been, like, even if it isn't a active thought, it's a subconscious thought that we've been actively trying to get back.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And that faces that, for most of us who haven't, you know, lived on the continent or can't even trace ourselves back to the continent, that is the thing, right? And I think for me, that was the thing when I watched Black Panther, was like, this possibly will be the only time where I can place myself within this space and feel like I am a part of a continent of people who I don't know familiarly, but it feels like a familiar relationship, right? And then it opens up that door for, you know, more conversation, for really kind of taking apart some of the parts of the movie that really needed discussion. Yeah.
In particular, with having Killmonger as a opposing force, and also sort of representing like the Black American experience. Granted, maybe like the darker ends of it, like it's if it's like, it could be like a sequel to Fruitvale, right? Like let's say like he survives and then he actually becomes Killmonger, kind of a thing, and like how that turmoil and how that darkness can be unleashed in a bad way. And I like that it's sort of a cautionary tale against that, and that it's represented there.
Well, the Killmonger thing's really interesting too. In like, so like, you know, the country Liberia was created by like a society, like it was a white society in the 1850s who were like, yo, let's like create a colony in Africa to send Black people back to. And like fascinatingly, when Black Americans end up going to Liberia, it did not work because the values are different by then. Whereas like once you're in North America, that's where you are, that's where you're from, you're part of that culture. And like there's something really, really fascinating kind of about like global Blackness, right? Like I'd be especially curious about like maybe like a Brazilian perspective too,
right?
On what Blackness means in Brazil, where it's like I think it's what's her name? Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie had a thing about how.
Who is that?
Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie.
No, I mean, who is she?
Oh, she wrote Americana. She's an author,
gotcha.
Nigerian author. And like she wrote about how in Nigeria, you know, you're Igbo, or like you're not. There's no such thing as Black in Nigeria. There's
no such thing as Black, and it's not even, I mean, it's a little bit Nigerian, but also you're usually going to be talking about your people group first. So you're going to say, exactly. I'm Yoruba, I'm Igbo, I'm Hausa. Exactly. Like you're not going to necessarily say Nigerian first.
But then she spoke, and
unless you're outside of Nigeria.
And then she literally spoke to this in her book Americana, which I'd recommend it anyway. It's a brilliant book. And it's like, as soon as her character gets to America, she's suddenly Black, and she's labeled as Black. And she has to confront, and then she has a line about how she had to then take on the 400 years of baggage of North American Blackness. All like that came onto her, because, you know, as soon as you're a Black person in America, you're a Black person in America. Like no matter where the crap you came from, whatever your history was, is out the door. You're now a Black person in America, and you're part of that tradition, because that's how American society sees you.
There was a YouTube channel called Cut. Well, they're still around, and they deleted this video since it came out. But it was like the idea of like, let's rate the blackness of these like black people. And there was a gentleman from Nigeria who came over, and they didn't even like. He said, oh, same thing what you're saying with her is that when he came over, like, or when he's in Nigeria, I wasn't black. I was just there. I was just a person. You know what I mean? And it's not until you come over that you're like, oh. Now I get what like, you know, what it means to be like black. Like he's heard of it before, like he's heard the term, you know, in media or whatever, but he didn't really get it until he came to the States.
Well, it's like even you can see with Obama, right? Like part of the narrative around Obama was, is he black enough? Or like even like in and I guess it's a pathology of slavery, of course. And it's like in Jamaican society, one of the things was it was kind of like a race-based quota where it's like, the lighter your skin, the more privileges you were given. So the darker your skin got, the worse it got, and the worse it got, and the worse it got, and the worse it got. So it's like there's this like deep inheritance. It's all from the power structure of white
and
supremacy.
Racism is crazy. Like what you were saying before about like the white men who created this in the 17 and 1800s is that it is like possibly the most effective caste system ever because it's so visual and quick, you know, like it's just like, oh yeah, that person's on my team. That person's not on my team, which was not part of human history until the last 400, 500 years, you know, which is insane.
Here's where it gets so dark and nefarious, right? There's this wicked book by, her name's Nell Irvin Painter, and it's called A History of White People. And it is an ethnography of Western culture's conceptions of other. So it starts with like how they talk about barbarians back in Roman times. Like the barbarians were like this, that, and the other. And it centers on this Western beauty ideal in the 1800s when the idea of whiteness was invented. And whiteness was invented specifically in America by the white upper class so that the poor white lower classes didn't rise up against them, literally.
Something similar to what we were experiencing over the past few years, I would say. Quite possibly.
It's a legacy of it, right? It's like this system was created 200 years ago so that all these poor white people who were getting fucked over by capitalism, all the same, fucked over by a system that only empowers 1%, all the same, it told those poor white people, no, at least you ain't black. You good, you're not black. You good, you're not black. It doesn't matter that like you are essentially an indentured laborer and you are living in an indentured poverty system that's going to keep you poor and now like addicted to opioids today. But it's like, you know.
Yeah, and I think that Antoine, when you brought up Killmonger, that reminded me so much of like watching the film where I was like, this is a door to having conversations with African immigrants about the US experience of blackness. And like, you know, some of my friends who are from different parts of Africa, like, yeah, you know, kind of like the way we see these movies about y'all over here, you know, and you're lazy and this and that. It's like,
yeah. You would hear that. You hear that a lot from some African families where they'll tell their daughters and sons, hey, don't get with any Black American because they're supposed to be wild or something. You know what I mean? Like that perception is even there, not just to white people and every other kind of race, but our own motherland, you know?
But it's like that goes back to the minstrel shows, right? Like, and who's been making the media, who's been controlling the message, and for why and for what, right? Like that's always been, and that's why, you know, from essentially Jordan Peele to Black Panther to things like Lovecraft Country, to kind of bring that into discussion too. It's like, that's why having control over the story, being able to tell your own story is so important. Where you're centering yourself in narrative now. You're not, you know, a stereotype. You're not like this figure of fancy to be made fun of or to be feared. You're actually a person. Because like it's like, you know, like basically until Black Panther, the only Black stories you could tell in America were homies on the porch or slavery.
Yeah.
It was interesting. There's just been ebb and flows, right? Because I feel like there was a renaissance in the 90s where you had like, you know, Living Single and Martin and all these other things. So you got to see that Black people weren't a monolith and that we were all individual people. Like, you know, you have Urkel, you know, you have like, oh, there's nerdy Black people too. It's like, yeah, I've existed like forever. Like Donald Glover said, it was illegal to be a Black nerd until 2003, right? So it's like, it's been like the case of we've had these heels of opportunity and progress that kind of dip occasionally, right? And I'm just hoping that the one that we're on now is sustained, rather than it just being another heel that goes like, oh, remember like when we had that back in the day, and when are we gonna have that again? You know, like I would love to see it just sustain.
I want to give a quick shout out to the original run of the Boondocks. And like the 2000s.
Wait, what do you mean original run? Is there another one coming or something?
They like did like another season a few years ago.
Oh, okay.
But like bringing up kind of like and a futurist narrative centered in North America. Like when you brought that up, I immediately thought of the Boondocks episode where Martin Luther King doesn't die.
Oh,
and
right.
I found that to be one of the most like that was foundational for me, and like I still consider it one of the most powerful bits of media I've consumed.
Yeah,
because like it is Afrofuturism. It's like and like Rodney McGruder is a black guy, and like the center in like the whole story is what if he didn't die? What if he didn't die? You know. And it takes that story, it looks at American culture, and it's not a very, very good look at American culture of how things had moved in the 30 plus years. And you know, it kind of ends with Martin Luther King or
I'm moving to Canada.
Yeah. He'll
be up there with you.
There you go. I mean, I think to that effect, we're getting a lot of interesting questions in the Q&A here, perhaps examining some of the shortcomings when it comes to representation, or, you know, being conscious that simply powerful or a single powerful image is not enough, and it needs to inspire some trends. So there are a few things people brought up here. One was that perhaps is it potentially problematic that even though Wakanda is quite autonomous and, you know, powerful, they are still fundamentally owned by corporate interests because of vibranium as a resource. And then there's this other one.
There's thoughts on that one.
We'll get to that one, but just this other one.
Disney Corporation, Disney made the movie.
Exactly that, and the very film, just the ending of the film where it was Martin Freeman's character who technically saved the day. And I read this sort of very facetious summary of the premise of Black Panther. Someone said it pointedly to make a remark. It was a movie about a CIA agent that restored the rightful monarch to an African throne. So you can obviously see there are some potentially negative interpretations when it comes to representation as well. So maybe I'd be curious to hear.
I actually interpret that specific thing differently. And that's more of, we need the help to actually push through. And it was more of him helping along rather than him taking over and saving the day. Because there have been moments where there had been like the white savior trope. I don't think that plays in Black Panther necessarily. Sorry, my light just went out. So in that one in particular, I disagree with in terms of like that specific moment. But I do recognize that that has happened. Like what was the Hidden Figures? There was definitely white trope stuff in there, and all the time. What the one with I can't remember the lady's name, the football movie. Like that, it's happened before.
Oh, The Blind Side.
Yeah, that's what it was. The Blind Side. Yeah.
Sandra Bullock, she's gonna save us.
I do think though that the ending is complicated. I mean, it's. I initially I was not critical of it. In the few other times that I watched it, I sort of became a little bit more critical of it, especially considering the relationship between the CIA and the Black community in the U.S. It's pretty complicated. I had a couple of people then send me some things about the way the CIA kind of looks at different movies and things like that, and I thought that was really interesting. But I was a little frustrated about the end, and I know that there are some people that I've talked to that are like, you know, that's not a big deal. The point is that this happened and blah blah blah. And I'm like, yeah, but at the same time, did he have to be the one to shoot down the planes? Could it have been Shuri? Could it have been somebody else? I mean, why did he play such an important piece at the end? And I think that's one of the things that's complicated for me in terms of not only the movie, but also in thinking about in my day job, I do diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And I begin to think about something that what you said, Antoine, is that for us to be on a particular journey together, do we need white folks to be on the same page with us, and it's a yes. And also, again, we're going back to it's complicated.
Yes, exactly. And that's like the idea from Malcolm X, right? Like that
Yeah.
famous anecdote he had about, I think it was a rally he did or something, and then a white liberal woman came up and said, you know, what can I do as a white woman to help? And he's like, not a damn thing. But then later on in his career, when he, you know, had his, he did the rite of passage and everything, he was like, actually, I think I would have gone back and said, you know what, like, this is what you could have done, you know, instead of it being a complete, like, no, you stay away from me entirely.
Yep.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting. 'Cause I agree with the critiques to a certain extent as well. But I just kind of had a thought where it's like, okay, so Black Panther, rightfully, like, every movie deserves a critique, but like, why ain't nobody critiquing like Captain America for being Captain America? You know, like why is it the Black Panther has this standard to live up to? You know, it's like the same thing with Obama. It's like he had the different standard to live up to, where it's like the amount of it's like, and like, you know, the criticism is fascinating, especially when it comes from white culture, and it's like, okay, but like, whose standard are we playing with here? And like, yeah, it is like, you know, why did the white guy have to shoot down the planes? I mean, you know, we got to work together, we got to help each other. At the same time, like, there is a weird thing about, like, there's got to be a way in for white audiences with movies, and with like non-white media. There's always like that more neutral character that's literally there to like assuage the white audience and make them feel okay. And kind of like that's what he was there for, in a sense, right? And by him playing the hero role, could you argue that maybe he was there so the white people could feel they were involved in that story, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other part, it kind of makes me laugh as you brought up former President Obama, and one of the things I used to say when I would hear criticism from both Black folks and white folks was, you know, we elected the worst Black student union president ever. I mean, like, because Black people were so upset with him around a lot, and sometimes rightfully so, around some of the things that he was doing around Blackness. But then white people would get upset because he did a little something for Blackness. It's just like,
right. Yeah.
He is not the president of the Black Student Union. He's the president of the United States of America with all kinds of restrictions and things like that.
But it's like, to the Americans, he's just the president for the Blacks, though, right?
Right, exactly.
That's the optics.
And that's kind of interesting because he, same with Obama being mixed race, right? Like that's kind of the issue in part, right? Because you're never good enough for either side, and you're always in like this middle road kind of situation. And his presidency kind of was that for, you know, the whole entire time.
I also just think like I guess in terms of the movie, like with the CIA agent kind of sort of saving the day, I kind of wish he just wasn't a CIA agent. I would have been cool if it had been, you know, spoiler alert, Winter Soldier, like, or somehow.
That's true. That would have been cool if it was him.
Okay, great.
Bucky would have been much better.
Especially given the CIA's history with, say, the, you know, actual Black Panthers.
Right, exactly. That is the thing. I think that was the thing that frustrated me the most. It's not that
Fred Hampton's not about this.
Yeah. It's not that he was a white guy, although that is troubling in its own self around colonization. But the CIA point was the thing of like the actual Black Panthers, though. There's a history there, you know. So it's definitely one of those things that's a little troubling about the movie. But as someone in the chat said, like, it doesn't stop me from watching it. I still love it. I still see so many more things that I can, you know, talk with friends about that have nothing to do with the white guy at the end.
There you go. I guess part and parcel with that, we're getting a lot of questions about the portrayal of Killmonger and his motivations in particular, and how that compares to T'Challa's, and whether or not those two perspectives, which each character represents, are fleshed out as well as they could be. So I'm just curious to hear everyone's general thoughts on that.
Well, I think the original cut of the movie was like 4 hours, right? Something like that. Yeah. So to answer that, I guess that in part, no, it wasn't as fleshed out as it could have been. But considering how you have to consolidate a movie to like 2.5 hours, which it still was even a long movie in that regard. And some of the deleted scenes you watch, like there was one with Okoye and her boo. I forget his name. The rhino guy.
Daniel Kaluuya.
One of not Daniel Kaluuya. Like I mean that's the actor's name, but I forget the
Wakabi, I think.
Wakabi, thank you. Yeah. So like there was a great deleted scene between them that I was like, that needed to be in the movie, you know, like so in that way, I would say no, it's not developed as much as it could have been or delved in as much, but it at least had the foundation that it needed to be there just to have a conversation start around that, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the thing about Killmonger is so one of the things that I'm not as upset about the way in which Killmonger was kind of written because it's within this kind of black perspective, right? So it's like from a Black American perspective, this is, as one of you all said earlier, I think it was Antoine said earlier, is like, this is the extreme of what can happen in a society that it's full on oppressive, right? And this is what can happen. So he's like the, well,
it's like a reality, right? Because think about the Black Panther movement in the States that got broken up. What came of that? Very, very many gangs, a lot of drugs, right? So it's very similar to Killmonger. He became part of the biggest gang. He started working for the US government. So it's that same sort of allusion to that. So like, the inverse of that is that if there's no leadership, if there's no tradition, if there's no looking back, there's no guidance, then this is what you're gonna get right here, and we've seen it in history. Like we have it, the reality of the Black Panther Party and what came of that.
And I think a big thing to touch on is his rage.
Yeah.
The rage of Killmonger was something that they really emphasized, which like I found to both be like startling but justified. I don't know about the two of you, but I kind of empathized with him.
Oh no, definitely you have to.
More so than I did with T'Challa.
Yeah, so when he's at the end, he's saying, I mean, granted, like the things that he's proposing, I don't think any of us would agree with, but in terms of the catharsis that got him there, like I think any of us could be like, yeah, I felt that way too. Like, I just want everybody just to like, I remember when I first watched Roots when I was in middle school or elementary school. That whole week, I hated every white person I saw. Like, that's not, of course, the right way to go about it. Like, for instance, I had a experience in Japan before the pandemic when I traveled there. There's a gentleman there who was from New Zealand or something, right? And it was a Halloween. So he was dressed up as, I didn't know what he was dressed up as. I was like, oh, hey, are you a soccer player? He's like, oh, no, rugby. And he's like, what are you dressed up as a black guy? I could easily lash out in that moment, right? And do that sort of a thing. But instead, I spoke to that person and educated him, or just made him know that, like, dude, I'm just like a regular dude. I'm not like, just I'm dressed as a black guy kind of thing. So it's that idea of, yes, having that feeling, letting it release and release it in a positive way, right? I forget the gentleman's name. There's a guy who, during the height of the Ku Klux Klan, he helped convert a lot of them because he was able to show that, hey, I'm a black guy, I'm not dumb, I'm not a hoodlum, that kind of thing. And just by having conversations with them, he converted many of them to leave the Ku Klux Klan, because like, wait, what? Who are these people I'm hating? You realize I've never had a drink with a black guy before, that sort of a thing, right? So yes, totally understand Killmonger, where he's come from, and understand that rage. And I can see how if you have all of that and you're dealing with that for a lifetime and you don't have any guidance to do anything better, totally understandable. Well, but then also
you're given are the tools of like a soldier of fortune, so like the only thing we had to pursue this rage was that of a tool of the imperialist American government.
Right. And so Killmonger for me, because of that, is very complicated, because like I get the rage, I get it. If you understand, the historical context of, the CIA's relationship with Black community, the Black Panther Party itself being infiltrated, all of those kinds of things, I see the rage, I get it. And yet it's complicated because the relationship that he has to Black women within the film is startling, to say the least. And a Black woman elder too, that was like, for me, I was done with him. I could not. I was like, I understand the rage, and I find that the way that he was moving through the space was destructive in itself, destructive for himself as an individual, but destructive for the relationships that he could have built within that particular society, right? And so you have a society whose main goddess is a female woman, type goddess, which grounds Black womanhood, and he is basically kind of stomping in and trying to destroy that.
Well, he's emblematic of toxic masculinity, isn't he?
Yes.
And
So
the system which he grew up in, like that.
Right.
That I love that critique in the film, because he's doing the same thing that has been done to him, and it's not a healthy or conducive way to progress.
Yeah, definitely. But so that's what makes them complicated, right? And then therein lies just yet another conversation that can be had with Black men and Black women about, and this is across the diaspora, about the ways in which we have consumed white toxic masculinity and put it and infused it into our communities all over the world. It's not just us in America, it's all over the world, and you see it in many different forms. And how can we then eliminate that, or figure a way out to be able to love on people who have been affected by toxic masculinity? And that's just not women, men too, in the ways in which men are taught not to have emotions, are taught not to be connected to one another, all of those kinds of things.
It's arguably tougher for Black men because of the way society puts Black men into a certain kind of box, right? And says the Black men are meant to be this basically Adonis-like and stoic and strong and like hyper masculine, athletic, dominant, physical, all these things, right? And the last thing our society says is a Black man is meant to be like emotional, and it's like, of course this applies to white men as well, but it's particularly virulent when applied to Black men. You can look at it with like American football or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. So no, I think it's really, really interesting to kind of like center Killmonger's approach in gender. I think that's really, really, really fascinating and really like enlightening almost.
I think, well, even to factor in you saying about like American football, I would say even it's more so with gang culture, because you had the difference of the Black Panther Party where they're providers to their communities versus, being aggressors of the community. And I think that's, again, like that's why I love the movie so much in Killmonger, because he represents so much. And if you don't know all of it, that's still fine. You still get the gist of it. But if you really know like the history behind a Killmonger, it's just so much more significant.
Right. And I think so I'm going to push back just a little bit on you, Rashid, in terms of, is it harder for Black men? I think Black men labor is definitely more visible in terms of the ways in which Black male identity is more visible, right? And yet I think I reflect on the movie again and think of the ways in which, and this was another thing that I really wanted to kind of write about when the movie came out, but I never got a chance to, the ways in which the women in the movie were in many ways kind of debating on where you have Okoye and
Mama Panther and the Nakia, I think you're thinking about, right?
And there was a moment when Okoye and Nakia were talking, and Nakia is like, "We got to go," and Okoye is like, "Nope, I am a servant to the throne." And in many ways, for me, that was a conversation around, do we at all costs protect Blackness, or regardless of, what's happening over here in terms of Blackness, this dysfunction over here, do we just protect it? Or do we push against it and say, no, we're not going to do that? And that is a conversation I think that Black women are often having around Black men. I can't remember what his name is, but he had did the Nat Turner movie, and then it came out that
and
all of that, and then people were just like, nope, especially Black women were like, nope, I'm done with that. Well, he just came out with a new movie. Movie looks great, but I absolutely am not going to go see that. And it's like, do I protect the Blackness, or do I protect what I think is, the protection of humanity in terms of the Blackness, right? So I'm not going to, just be like, it's all good because you Black. No, I cannot do that, right? And I think that that's a conversation that Black women have all the time in regards to Black men and the ways in which Black men are treated in society, and then how they bring that to the community, how they bring that to the women in their lives and that kind of thing. There's a really great clip of James Baldwin and Nikki Giovanni kind of going back and forth. And Nikki Giovanni says to him, I get it that you get kicked, beaten down and spit on by this white dude, but don't bring that home to me. You say to him, yes, sir, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. You give him all your love, but then you bring your hate home to me. How about you don't do that? And so I think that for me with the movie itself was another interesting kind of conversation around Killmonger and T'Challa. Are we going to, embrace Killmonger because he's on the throne, or are we going to follow what we know to be right?
This is sort of Black speculative fiction at its best, right? Because you have this very fantasy-based movie or sci-fi fantasy movie,
right, that
can touch on all this and get all these themes, but have this, this like superhero coding on it, right? Like, I think that's amazing. I don't know, like just appreciating that in general. I think it's crazy.
Yeah, definitely. And I love that you brought up Blank Man and Meteor Man way earlier.
Right.
Those are some like movies that we don't get a lot of conversation around, and yet
Meteor Man in particular too, because there's a message at the end of that movie where it's like, don't wait for a superhero to come and fix your community, like take the responsibility and do it yourself, which I thought was like, whoa, like that scene at the end where everybody's, when he lost his powers and they're like, oh, where are you? It's like, can you guys just get up and like fight these Golden Lords yourself? Like that movie's amazing. It's so underrated. It's cheesy. It's very cheesy, but it's so underrated.
Yeah.
And I think that just relates to another thing people have been putting a lot in the chat, and a lot of the questions have touched upon the idea of, shaping narratives, whether it be through art or through history, as many of you were discussing earlier. And there's a question earlier from someone who's actually a history teacher, and they were discussing specifically how to teach African civilizations on the curriculum. And sort of just to bring this conversation full circle with what we were discussing earlier, how do you all think that tools such as, art, media, etc., can be used to reshape those traditional narratives, and how can they be most effective?
I mean, the reality is that when we are talking about history, we need to kind of kick the history books to the side and really use. And this is where we can kind of begin to merge this understanding of technology and history. There's so many great things out there right now that you don't need a history book, because really history books are just like, again, dead folks and dates. It's like, it's not it doesn't give you the full rich understanding, and it doesn't even challenge you to think.
I think you don't get that until you get to university, because it wasn't until university that I truly started getting more of what it was considered like the marginal like history. Like I think we just need to insert the university into our public systems or into our elementary, high school systems.
I think there's also like different ways of conveying information that can like bring out story. Like I love reading, I love books, and I love history, but I fucking hate reading. I hate books. And I hate old quotes. Straight up, like I love reading. I love history. I hate old quotes. I hated having to read these fucking things like 17 times over and over again, not understanding it because it was written by some fucking clown ass in the 1400s. And I'm like, I don't get it, man. I don't get it, right? Like that, but my mind wants to learn this shit. So like part of my approach as a historian and as an independent publisher has been to kind of like frame my histories through storytelling, where it's like, you got to have your facts, of course. But your facts you couch within visuals, right? You got to have lots of pictures, you got to have lots of maps, and you got to make it engaging. But the key is stories. Stories are what build out the bare bones of these facts. You know, it's like, you know, Buddy did thing and time and stuff and whatever, cool, whatever. Let's actually hear a story about someone living at that time in that world, written in an accessible way that is easy for people to understand, right? As opposed to like written by some old white man for other old white people to teach young Black people, because that's literally what history books have been for 200 years, is an old white man writes a book for other old white people to then teach non-white people the shit. And it's like, no, that's not how we do. We gotta write our own history books, you know what I mean?
It's indoctrination, essentially.
Yeah.
It's indoctrination for, and just like you, Antoine, like like my household was very like, yeah, you know, Black people are awesome. We've created a lot of things, blah, blah, blah. It's amazing. We're amazing Black people. Yay. Right. But in terms of really kind of understanding the depth of the history of Blackness, it wasn't until I got to college. It was like where I started reading Black authors, both fiction and nonfiction, where I started exploring, you know, courses that talked, you know, about, you know, not just pyramids, slavery, Martin Luther King Jr., everybody happy now, you know, not, I mean, you know, those types of things. It was definitely a while before I even experienced that. And I would say college too. But that's one of the things that I think I love about Black Panther, because you can start off talking about Wakanda and say, guess what? There were hundreds of Wakandas, hundreds of thousands of Wakandas on the African continent before colonization. There were dynasties and, you know, and
straight up empires, you know, like they existed already.
Yeah, that were in many ways like Wakanda for their time periods. And let's do some work around that. Right.
Timbuktu in particular, like that was like the sought after scholastic, you know, place that you went to, like especially for Arabia, you know, in particular. People would literally like come from all over just to go there, and like the thought that places like that didn't exist or could not exist is just like completely ridiculous and need to be taught, you know.
Right.
And the same way we know Abraham Lincoln or Alexander the Great, like Mansa Musa, I didn't know about him until university. You know what I mean? Like we should be knowing about him as children.
Yeah, so we've already had Wakanda in so many different ways, but utilizing this movie as an opportunity to bridge a link between fiction, between the fantastic and the reality of society is one of the things that I really, really love about this movie, is that you can take some real contemporary conversations that need to be had and put them before young people, old people, and really begin to have that conversation based on the fantastic.
And mold it in a digestible way, as Rashid was saying, you know, like that's how you get people in there, right? Like, and that's the reason why I wrote my fantasy series too. It was a way to trick people into learning like African history. Like, oh, what is this? Like, where'd you get the idea of these, like, you know, these famed archers? I was like, oh, that's just the Nubians, like that they're called the Tasseti, like, you know, like stuff like that, you know, like, or just like, where'd you get like this crazy monster thing from? It's like, oh, it's from Angola. Like, you know, it's like tricking people into like, here's a little snippet, really cool, right? Hey, actually, let's learn some real history based off of this, right?
Right. And that kind of in a small little switch reminds me a little bit of Lovecraft Country, in the sense of when they, spoiler alert folks, when they did the summoning to get rid of the racist in the house. I mean, just that conversation for me with some of my Christian friends around like, you know, these religions that we kick to the side, that, you know, kind of part of our history, you know, we should be thinking about them a little bit more. We should be exploring them a little bit more, you know, all of that kind of stuff. But it's things like that I think you can bring into conversations, you can bring into the classroom and say, listen, here's this event that happened, you know, and let's talk about it from both the fantastic point of view of, like, for instance, when we're thinking about Tulsa with Watchmen, you know, what would have happened if the Tulsa riot never happened? What would have happened? I mean, Lovecraft also has a tie to Tulsa too. But
yeah, they both did too. Yeah.
I mean, so it's like one of those ways that you can bring in the fantastic to talk about reality.
I think another really neat way to kind of bring in these stories in an educational way are through fables. Like there are dozens and dozens and dozens of folk fables from like across the African diaspora that are like fables are for children. That's kind of their shtick, right? So I think that's a really really neat way to kind of like pique people on again in more more academic kind of way.
I mean, that's what's happening right now. I don't know if you guys have read Kwame Mbalia's Tristan Strong Punches a Hole Through the Sky, but that is basically all like African-American folklore, and it's being told, and children are freaking eating that up, just like they ate up Percy Jackson, and then Children, Blood and Bone with Tomi Adeyemi and the Orisha stuff. It's all, yeah. Again, I think like to answer the overarching question, yeah, I think media and these stories are the best ways to like kind of, you know, get people like in the same way that we all know about the Greek gods as much as we know the Roman gods, the Norse and everything like that.
All that like
putting that forward.
Yeah, no, it's like in our cultural legacy, we have all of these like white gods and queens and princesses, and it's like, well, what about ours? Where are ours? Where are ours in this story? And you know, where they come in is like they're written by us, for us, so that we can see ourselves and then feel empowered to tell our own stories moving forward too.
And on that note, one of the other questions that arose was someone was looking for specific suggestions for works of Afrofuturism in multiple genres. So Antoine, you already mentioned that excellent book. So I'd just like to hear from all three of you as we
like recommendations.
We round off here, and perhaps also a chance for you all to promote your own individual projects and published works. So maybe Antoine, we can start with you.
Oh yeah. So yeah, as I was saying before, Kwame Mbalia not just came out. He actually came out with the second book, which is called Tristan Strong Destroys the World. So I'm like, what's gonna happen next? Is he gonna destroy the universe, the galaxy? How do you progress this trilogy? It's like very great one is yeah, exactly. Very similar. So yes, if you have young children who need that help of figuring out maybe some African history or some African American specifically folklore, like for instance, he runs around with John Henry and Brer Rabbit. It's freaking awesome. That's a great one. That's a great one to look at. If you want to go a little bit older with young adult, there's Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi, and Akata Witch by Nnedi Okorafor. Very good ones if you want to try that. Adult N.K. Jemisin, you can't go wrong with her. The fifth season is a great one. She just did one recently called The City We Became, which is fantastic as well. And then of course, yes, then there's my books as well in the indie sphere. I'm also doing something that's very similar. I'm doing young adult that's based around the Orishas, called TJ Young and the Orishas. The Gatekeeper Staff is the book one. I also do Tales from Essawan, which is more my pre-colonial, old-timey African stuff, in which I do a lot of African myth and that sort of a thing. But yeah, definitely check out. There's many authors out there that are doing really great work. This last year in particular, I saw a slew of new works that should not be overlooked.
And Antoine also has a great YouTube channel. So
my YouTube channel. Yeah. The reason I don't miss my YouTube channel is because I talk about things that are not African related. So I'm like, let's forget about them. But yes, for sure.
But it definitely should not be missed either. How about you, Stephanie?
Yeah, especially if you love gaming, you don't want to miss out on.
and versus videos, to be fair, that's what drew me.
Vader versus Voldemort.
Yeah, I always kind of take it old school a little bit in terms of people who I recommend. Is Octavia Butler for sure.
Gotta name her.
Yeah, Samuel Delaney. If you are Black and queer, his stuff is jarring and also like, aha, I get to see myself a little bit, or maybe not. You never know. I was reading this book a while back, and this is kind of like for middle schoolers or high schoolers, called New Orleans, which was really amazing. I can't remember the name of the author, but it was kind of like after Katrina, and it was a brilliant Afrofuturist book. But yeah, there are so many books out there. Antoine named some really great ones. The Children of Blood and Bone. I have not got to it yet. It is on my list, but I will get to it. And of course, I wrote a book.
They just started casting too for the movie, because also got like Lucasfilm is doing it, right? They just started casting for it, so it's coming. It's coming.
Okay, that is amazing. I'm excited for that. I also wrote a book called Bright City. It's under my pen name, DC Edwards. If you get a chance, check it out. It's on Amazon, I think. Still, yes. And that's it.
Awesome. And I'll just remind everyone the links for all our panelists' info are in the chat, so feel free to check those out. And Rashid, how about you?
Yeah, I'm gonna zig where everyone zagged actually, and I'm gonna recommend some music. So let's
Oh yeah, good job.
Yes,
some Sun Ra, maybe a bit of Herbie Hancock if you're feeling it, maybe a bit of Gil Scott Heron if you're feeling it. But definitely hit up Spotify, check out Sun Ra, hit one of his playlists, like maybe his radio one. It'll take you on a journey.
yes.
So with all those book lists you got there, listen to some Sun Ra while you're at it too. And yeah, as for me, I guess I'm a independent publisher-ish. Like I started a little cooperative out of a music bar here in Toronto, the beginning of COVID, and yeah, we make books and tell stories, and we emphasize kind of like the synthesis between words and pictures, because words on their own are crazy. Like it's like this, they've always said, pictures worth 1,000 words. So it's like, why hasn't, let's do that then. Why write so much? So yeah, that's me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And maybe if anyone had like closing remarks they'd like to share before we wrap up, I'd love to hear them. I realize we could talk about this forever and ever, but I don't know if you just want to like summarize your thoughts, your points, anything you didn't mention earlier, didn't get the chance to, that you'd like
to wrap it up. I think I would say like what I was saying before earlier, where I was saying how these things kind of happen in ebb and flows. You know what I'm saying? Like we were talking about like Tulsa, what would happen if that continued on? What would happen if the Black Panther Party continued on? What if like the 90s Renaissance of media continued on? We're going through that right now. So I would say, if you're out there, let's try and keep this going as a sustained thing rather than it just being like a blip on the map as it's been the past few times. And to do that, it's really, just to put the support out there and not just to say that you're about it, but be about it as well. So.
Amazing. It's so true, especially now. How about you, Stephanie?
Yeah, I think that for me, as I am passionate about history, and I've used Black Panther in a number of ways to kind of begin conversations and use it to kind of talk a little bit about, particularly in a U.S. context, what it means to be angry in terms of Killmonger, what it means to have conversations with our brothers and sisters across the diaspora about the nature of colonialism in our various forms, right? Because we all experience in a lot of different ways. And so I love this movie for all of it being complicated, for all of my complicated feelings about it. But I would really encourage folks to really dig deep into how we can explore history in a way that really creates a full narrative rather than just taking the sound bites that we are given.
Amazing. So true. Rashid, final word, my friend.
Yeah, I'd like everyone to take away that you can do anything you want to as a creative person if you got a story to tell. If you got a story to tell, like truly, it's your greatest power is your voice, and however you want to share it, however you can share it. Don't let anyone tell you there's only one way to do things. Like I remember when I was trying to talk to my dad about writing some stuff about his crazy life, I could see he kind of like he used to be a professor and he was taught to write a certain way, and I could see him kind of like stop himself and be like, oh, and I'm like, no, Baba, listen. Like, I don't want you to write in that 5-paragraph bullshit way the English taught you. Like, Baba, I want you to tell me a story like you've been telling me stories as your son my whole life. I want it to be me and you walking down the beach in Kikambala in Kenya. And I want you to be telling me that story that way. So like that's kind of what I hope we can all take away from this, is that our voices are no longer being restricted. Our voices are loud and clear. We have platforms, and we have the technology to communicate our ideas in a way we've never been able to before. Let's do it. Let's have some fun with it. Let's do it our way for us, help each other and support each other. It's exciting.
I couldn't have thought of a better note to end on. So that's awesome. Thank you, Rashid. Before we wrap up here, I just wanted to promote a few of the other events we have going on around Afrofuturism here at Lit and Lib. So if you want to hear more of Stephanie's excellent insight, there are two things you should look out for. One is another webinar February 24th called Black and Indigenous Futurisms. Stephanie is one of the panelists there. So definitely consider registering and attending that. All the links will be in the chat. And Stephanie is also going to appear on our podcast in the episode coming out this Sunday, where she'll delve into Afrofuturism and her particular writings a little bit more. And then finally, on February 22nd, we have a panel event hosted by the Literary and Library Committee around Black voices in CanLit. So that is definitely not to be missed. All the links for those upcoming endeavors are in the chat, just so we can all stay aware of them. And I want to thank our three panelists, Antoine, Stephanie, and Rashid, for giving their time. This was a fascinating discussion, and I hope this will inspire people to continue these discussions in their own circles and writings. And I just want to give a shout out to the Hart House team for helping put this together, and also to everyone who attended. We loved having you here. And we hope you'll walk away from this event having learned a little something, adjusted your perspective, and hopefully trying to make the world a little bit of a better place through your creations. So thank you so much, everybody. Take care. And I thought this was going to be a bit tacky. Like originally for my symbol for shifting the slides, it was like this. Originally, I was thinking maybe this should be my symbol to switch the slides, but that might be a little bit too apropos. But maybe we could end it on, if you'll indulge me, maybe we could end this on that note. So thank you, everybody. Wakanda forever.
Thank you.
All right. All the best. Take care, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.